I'd like to spend a few minutes and talk about the legitimacy escalation archetype. If you've happened to click on the first version of this video and there was no sound, it's technology is wonderful when you remember all of the things you're supposed to do to get it to work right. So if you haven't heard of this archetype before, it's not a surprise in that I had not heard of it before until a couple weeks ago when I was wandering around the Water Center for Systems Thinking and looked at their Archetypes course, and the 9th lesson in the course talked about this archetype that they call the Repression and Revolution archetype, which seemed really interesting, and something that I'd not seen before. So I decided to put it together in Insight Maker, both as a causal loop diagram and as a simulation. So rather than walk through this, I put it into the whole set of archetypes as a outgrowth of fixes that fail, and you'll understand why that is in a minute. And the links to the things that are in this video are in the notes section for the video itself, so if you want to go directly to them and check it out. So this particular archetype starts out as a simple goal-seeking structure where there is a perceived threat, and the apparent solution is understood to address the underlying problem to therefore reducing the perceived threat or removing the underlying problem. As it evolves, it turns out that the apparent solution leads to legitimization of the problem itself, which causes the underlying problem itself to increase, and therefore you have created a vicious reinforcing loop. So even though you're addressing the underlying problem, the situation actually gets worse. And what makes this even more troublesome is that there's a feedback loop from the underlying problem, so that as the underlying problem increases, it increases the legitimacy of the problem itself, and you have another vicious reinforcing loop. So once this thing begins to go south, it goes south in a hurry. Now when I turned this into a simulation model, I looked at the underlying problem as a stock, the perceived threat as a stock, and the legitimacy as a stock. And from initially thinking about it, I looked at it as though once the perceived threat develops, it isn't diminished, so there's an inflow but no outflow. The same thing with the problem of legitimacy is that once it increases, there's no outflow, there's nothing in the cycle that causes it to decrease. So when I go ahead and simulate this, it acts pretty expectedly in terms of there's starting off with some initial conditions. You go ahead and address the underlying problem, which therefore declines the underlying problem, though what happens is that the perceived threat increases and doesn't decrease. And as you go ahead and modify the initial values, the results don't change much. Even if you change the underlying problem, it's still addressed. Though the curious thing that happens is with the problem of legitimacy, when it gets to a certain point, which is here, and the simulation is set up with sort of default values between 0 and 1 just to investigate the relationships as opposed to values associated with any particular situation. When this gets to 3.9, things are fine, but when it goes to 4, it turns into a vicious reinforcing cycle that it blows up, which I thought was real interesting, that there was that fine point in the set of relationships. And it might be, if any of you are interested, if you want to go ahead and clone this model and work with it and maybe evolve it some to add some options so that the perceived threat actually decreases or the problem legitimacy actually increases or decreases. I'd be interested in what you find with it. So here it is. Take a look. Let me know what you think. Bye.